against the backdrop of the declining sheen and glimmer and attractiveness of the liberal political economic project. Over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen the decline, for instance, of the United States. Many people associated the hegemonic place of democracy as being mirrored or reflected in the hegemonic place of the United States. And as we begin to see the United States in its relatively slow but nonetheless steady economic decline, and indeed the decline of America's prestige in international affairs, and we can see this being played out right now in presidential debates south of the border, we see the attractiveness of China as an alternative model. One doesn't need to look beyond what's going on in the European Union and to see what the principles of democracy in a supranational institution like the EU, and indeed the democracies and the very weak democracies inside the European Union, to increasingly look to China and its non-democratic allies as an attractive alternative. Indeed, as some of you might know, I teach a course every May in China. And it's a great opportunity for U of T students, but also for myself, to spend time in China engaged in real debate with people on the ground in China, academics, students, policymakers, and so on. This is in addition to the research that I normally do there. And I remember distinctly 2-3 years ago in which we talked about the prospects of democracy in China, and my colleagues there, otherwise very liberal-minded academics, largely educated in the West, would simply say to me, it's just not going to happen in China. Why would we choose a democratic path when the democratic path is showing itself to be institutionally, morally, and economically bankrupt? But in more recent years, and having the same conversation with the same people in China, we hear now rumblings about the need for political and economic reform. That on the eve of a major leadership transition inside authoritarian China right now, that there is serious talk of political reform. And so when I asked this friend of mine, I said, well, what do you mean by political reform? Are you talking about democracy? And he said, no, we're not talking about democracy. What we're talking about are things like elections, transparency, corruption, and accountability. I said, well, you can call it whatever you want, but that sure as hell sounds like democracy to me. But there is serious discussion now inside China about the prospects of this kind of political reform. In many ways, this discussion about the prospects of political reform in China were portended by these comments, actually, by the premier, the outgoing premier or prime minister of China, in which he, during an interview with the CNN, said, well, the people's wishes for and needs for democracy and freedom are irresistible. Now, this was a major statement. This was a statement that was eaten up, if you will, by commentators in the West and watchers of Chinese politics. For what it's worth, it was censored in China. So those who don't have access to means to getting around the firewall would not have heard this. But internationally and in international fora, this sentiment, this prediction, this diagnosis, if you will, all wrapped in one of the current situation and future situation in Chinese politics, is one that was not only stated by Premier Wen, but also echoed by the President of China in not dissimilar statements to the international press. It was also around this time that we saw the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to a dissident writer in China, which of course got the Chinese backs up, but nonetheless it created a sense of international awareness of this brewing prospect of political reform. For those of you who follow international news, and I hope as a consequence of taking this course you do, you all know that China right now is undergoing a leadership transition, not an election as we understand it, not as an election as we see, for instance, for the President of the United States, or what we might see in the future for the Prime Minister of Canada, but nonetheless a leadership transition within the upper echelons of the Chinese Communist Party, in which the CCP is now deciding its next generation of leaders, deciding who the next president will be, who the next premier will be, and so on. And as part of this selection process, there is a lot of discussion going on in China right now. Discussion about political reform. Discussion about the next 10 years and how China will continue to grow its economy in ways in which its political system can support this. And these are not just conversations being had by students like yourselves in dormitories and leading universities across China, but there's also a conversation being held by senior party members, Politburo members, members of the millions of members of the Chinese Communist Party, and commentators within Chinese politics. And this discussion is all about the prospects of political reform. Now, in the backdrop of this, so you have these very high-level discussions about what sort of political reforms do we need in China, and we've also seen in the last 5 years a spike, a real rise in the number of collective protests, at least the collective protests that are being reported now by the government. In the hundreds of thousands each year, we are seeing collective protests occurring in China. So the puzzle before us is basically this: what are the prospects for democracy in China? We hear a lot about political reform. We hear in some circles, even in the most liberal circles in China, some sense of the appeal of democracy. In trying to assess this puzzle, then, the prospects of democracy in China, we can begin to assess the viability of the Chinese political system as an alternative to democracy. So as you know, in a couple of weeks or 3 weeks or so, you had your first paper due. And the paper is on the resilience of the philosophical and institutional foundations of democracy. And over the last several weeks, we've talked about various challenges to democracy. Talked about the fascist and communist challenges. Last week we talked about some of the internal tensions and contradictions. And this week we're going to talk about the rise of China and the prospects for political reform as a potential challenge to democracy as well, and in many ways perhaps the most serious challenge to the long-term prospects of democracy. So before we get into some of the substance, we take out some clickers. I just want to get a sense from all of you from the outset where your own attitudes lie and in your own views of China. The first question is, should China be democratic? A, yes. B, a no. Okay, 56% of you say China should be democratic. 42% of you say no. Next question. Should governments of other countries, like ours, criticize China for its human rights record to encourage China to become a democracy? A, yes. B, no. %of you say yes, government should criticize. 42% of you say leave them alone. And last question, will China become a democracy sometime in the next 20 years? A, yes. B, no. Say it will, 66% say no. So if I were to gauge then dissents in this class, the majority of you have a normative view that China should be democratic, that it's justifiable, at least 57% of you say it's justifiable for foreign governments to criticize China and its human rights records in an effort to compel it to become a democracy. But 2/3 of you are skeptical as to whether or not this will in fact happen. 66% of you believe China will not be a democracy in 20 years, whereas only 32% of you believe that China will be a democracy in 20 years. We'll revisit these questions as we go through this lecture. In order to understand the prospects of democracy in China, one has to appreciate the fact that the idea of democracy, and indeed the idea of liberal democracy, is not foreign to China. That in fact over the past 100 or so years there have been lots of democratic moments. The potential for a democratic breakthrough in modern Chinese history. Part of this story takes us to the end of the Qing dynasty, which ended in the early 20th century, 1911, 1912. In order to understand the end of the Qing dynasty, in which the last emperor of China abdicated the imperial throne, one has to go back to other points in history. For instance, in 1842, China fought a war against England. It fought the war called the Opium War, because throughout the 19th century, English trading companies were essentially trading and selling opium in China, in the East India Trading Company, for instance. And in many ways, this trade had addicted many millions in China to opium, and had created a sort of moral national decay in China, never mind the loss of economic productivity, as everyone was effectively stoned on opium. And the Chinese rose up and said, we got to stop this. And we're going to fight a war against the English, because they're not listening to our pleas, and they're not listening to our economic sensibilities. So they fought this war and they were soundly defeated. And as a result of being defeated in this war, China had to cede, that is to say, give up lots of its land to British control, most notably Hong Kong. Not only did it have to give up its land, it also was forced to pay war reparations. In other words, it had to pay back the English for the cost that it cost the English to fight the war against the Chinese. This was a huge source of national defeat. This was a huge defeat for Chinese pride. In 1895, the Chinese fought another war. This time they fought it with the Japanese. Now, fighting a war against England, which was the undisputed industrial power at the time, is one thing. One could say, well, we lost the war to the West, the far more advanced industrial West. But in 1894, 1895, the Chinese fought a war against the Japanese in their own neighborhood, another Asian country. And one has to understand the sort of racial implications and racial hierarchies at the time. This was a war the Chinese could not lose, and they did. And in 1895, as a result of that war, the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed, which ceded to Japan parts of Chinese territory, most notably Taiwan. So in the run-up to the end of the Qing dynasty, essentially, we see this huge defeat for Chinese pride, a huge defeat for the Chinese nation. And in many ways, it was this defeated position, the sense of humiliation, and this sense of having been a victim to foreign aggression, that we set the stage for the end of the Qing dynasty. There are other factors as well that precipitated the end of the Qing dynasty. One, most importantly, being a population crisis. During the previous dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the population in China was around 80 million people. 200 years later, by the year 1850, the population of China was at 500 million, 480 million people. As you can imagine, rapid population growth with relatively sluggish economic growth meant that on average, people had a lower standard of living. that what was once a great nation, a great empire, a great race, and great peoples was now a nation of poor people. This was, of course, compounded by the fact of being an economic crisis. The rest of the world was moving ahead in terms of technological advancements. We see the rise of Europe. We see the Industrial Revolution in England. We see the proliferation of industry throughout continental Europe. We even see the industrialization of Japan. Right? Don't forget, Japan was an industrial nation by the early 20th century. Meanwhile, China was economically backward, was largely dependent on commodities exports, which meant that effectively prices were squeezed, and China was in a perpetual state of economic crisis. Together, these three things, national humiliation, a population crisis, and a perpetual economic crisis, set the stage for a nationalist revolution. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we see a nationalist revolution in the name of a modern Chinese nation. And we see the toppling of the Qing dynasty. Now, one has to remember, the Qing dynasty was not a Chinese dynasty. Or at least it was not an ethnically Han Chinese dynasty. It was a dynasty that was ruled by the Manchurians. Now, to the West, it made no difference. But inside of China, this was effectively a dynasty being run by foreign barbarians. It was therefore seen as an outsider regime. So it was with this that we saw a nationalist Republican revolution. It was led by Sun Yat-sen, an intellectual leader in southern China at the time. And a revolution is launched across China in which we see the overthrow of the emperor. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Last Emperor. It's a fantastic film. You have this child emperor who has no idea what's going on outside of the forbidden city or the emperor's, the imperial palace. Meanwhile, China has now undergone a Republican revolution, and he still thinks it's the Qing dynasty. We see the overthrow of the emperor in October of 1911. We see the proclamation of the Republic of China, and we see the emperor, the child emperor, finally realizing and abdicating the throne in 1912. Sun Yat-sen was elected the provisional president in 1912. And he led what was the KMT party, which basically meant the Nationalist Party. And the main goal of Sun Yat-sen, the Republican Revolution, and the Nationalist Party was to rebuild a unified China from out of this chaos that was the Qing dynasty. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we had this real moment of intellectual fervor, nationalist mobilization, a real sense of philosophical reflection, where people are asking themselves, what does it mean to be Chinese? How do we rebuild this great nation, this great civilization, as we are constantly reminded of 5,000 years? How do we rebuild a modern China? And it was from this that Sun Yat-sen develops the three principles. The first principle is the nation. The Chinese nation is to be the most important unit that we as a people, he would proclaim, are a nation, and a unified nation. Second was democracy. That this was no longer going to be a feudalistic dynastic regime as we saw in the Qing dynasty. This was no longer going to be about emperor worship as we saw in the various dynastic regimes, but rather this was going to be about democracy. This was going to be a new nation in which the people, the Chinese people, would be equal citizens. And welfare. That the nation was to care for its other citizens. That the nation had a responsibility to care for its citizens. If it's not altogether clear, you can see that this very much parallels, of course, Lincoln's notion of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The intellectual current in early 20th century China found its roots firmly based in the West. In many ways, if you were looking at China in 1912, you would have seen the most astute student of modernization. And yet, fast forward 100 years, and what was once thought to be the most astute student of modernization, a republic founded on the principles of the nation, of democracy, and of welfare, is in fact a modern China that is non-democratic. On the one hand, you see this image of Shanghai's skyline, at least the new part of the city. First time I was in Shanghai in 1991, that was a farmer's field. And now, 20 years later, it's this skyline here, one of the most famous skylines, now featured prominently in blockbuster films like Mission Impossible. That's modern China. A modern China of extraordinary wealth, of awesome economic growth, and all the trappings of modernity. And I juxtaposed this image against June 4th, 1989. In which you see the row of tanks, and that man right there, we still don't know who that is, just simply known as Tank Man, was one of the protesters in June 4th who stood in front of a column of tanks that was about to enter into Tiananmen Square. And as it turns out, he was rushed off, but no one knows what exactly happened to him. This image here, this is the People's Liberation Army about to enter into the square and effectively disperse with violent means the demonstration. So you have these two images. You have a very modern China, in one sense the astute student of modernization, and you have this very enduring image of what happened in June 4th, 1989 with students, not unlike yourselves today. Now, it's very hard to actually describe what kind of political system China has. And the political system in China is constantly changing. It's very dynamic. And as a result, we have this notion of democracy with Chinese characteristics. Or at least the leaders of China will say that there is democracy in China, but it's not Western-style democracy, it's democracy with Chinese characteristics. Even though we may not have a very firm sense of what it is, we know what it is not. And we know that the Chinese political system is not a democracy by Western definitions of liberal democracy. It is not what Robert Dahl described, or what I described to you as Reverend Robert Dahl described as polyarchy. It's not about inclusive contestation. It is not a political system in which we see institutionalized uncertainty and the possibility of alternatives taking the reins of power. In fact, any China watcher has known that Xi Jinping is going to be the next leader of China because we have known this for the last 2 years. So we know that it is not what Robert Dahl would call polyarchy, and it does not, as a political system, adhere to the virtues of what I call institutionalized uncertainty. In China, instead, what we see is a relatively, not entirely, but relatively poor human rights record. We see the absence of meaningful elections. We see very little separation of powers between the executive branch, the legislative branch, which is largely a rubber stamp, and the military. We see relatively fewer freedoms in terms of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. We see a very sophisticated censorship machine put into place. I recall probably 5 years ago, I was in Beijing, and I was in a Western 5-star hotel. That's where all the Westerners stay, and I'm watching CNN. And the news announcer says, breaking news from Lhasa, Tibet. And all of a sudden the screen goes blank. And I turned it to MSNBC, blank. I turned it to BBC, blank. Right? So there's a tremendous censorship machine put into place. At that moment, when there was to be some discussion of what were, it turns out, riots in Tibet, the entire media machinery was censored and shut down. In this respect, in many ways, China, and the brilliant case of China, and the brilliant example of China, is turning theory on its head. We in the West have long held to this theoretical notion of modernization, that as societies modernize, they become democratic. Thus, we would expect that as China continues to modernize, it too should be democratic, or at least leaning that way. So far, again, we haven't seen this. Again, I want to stress, however, that we don't want to foreclose the possibility that there may be democratic prospects in China. And I want to again provide for some sense, some historical sense, of the very fact that China has in fact experienced several democratic openings throughout modern Chinese history. That the idea of democracy and that the possibility of democracy was far from impossible, was in fact in many instances quite probable in China. The first is what we might call a democratic revolution. On October 1st, 1949, after several decades of civil war in China, the Chinese Communist Party, and Mao Zedong in particular, proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China. You recall in 1912, it was the Republic of China. In 1949, under the Chinese Communist Party, it had now become the People's Republic of China. And with Mao's proclamation, there were three guiding principles to what the PRC, or the People's Republic of China, would adhere to. The first was socialism. And socialism is a way of breaking the bonds and the exploitative bonds of feudalism. That despite its best efforts in the post-Qing dynasty era, Chinese society and the Chinese nation had continued to adhere to feudalistic tendencies. That it had not thrown off, if you will, the metaphorical shackles of feudalistic dynastic Chinese rule. So the first is socialism, but socialism is a way of breaking feudalism. The second guiding principle in this Maoist Chinese Communist Party revolution was that the basis of this new modern China was to be built upon, quote-unquote, the Chinese revolutionary spirit. That China had fought for this People's Republic of China. That the Chinese had not only defeated the Nationalist Party, and had now essentially forced them into exile in Taiwan through blood, sweat, and tears, but the Chinese had fought the Japanese. And fought back Japanese aggression, or at least attempted to fight back Japanese aggression. So if there was anything that was going to carry forward this new modern Chinese nation, it was going to be the people's revolutionary spirit, which lent itself to the third guiding principle, which was an anti-foreign nationalism. The Maoist Chinese Communist Party revolution went back to the stories of 1842 and the Opium War. Went back to the stories of the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895 and basically saying, look at Chinese history. We've been nothing but a victim to foreign aggression. We have been the lackey, if you will, of the rest of the world, as they have essentially invaded us, raped and pillaged our villages, and effectively forced us to give up our land, give up our sovereignty, and forced us to pay them for it. So what we saw institutionalized in 1949 was a deep sense of anti-foreign nationalism. That foreigners and foreign powers had nothing good for China. And that instead, through socialism and the people's revolutionary spirit, what we would have is a belief in self-reliance. That finally China was going to stand up. That it was going to be a strong and unified nation as imagined in 1912, but which failed subsequently. As you can imagine with any totalitarian, authoritarian regime, a lot of these guiding principles were wrapped up in the Maoist cult of personality. Mao himself was a great revolutionary. He was beloved by millions in China. He wasn't just simply a tyrant. he was loved. He led China in a war against the corrupt